This is Captain Picard of the USS Enterprise, and I just have to say, I am disappointed that I wasn't able to take part in this puppet episode. It's the first duty of every Starfleet officer to explore strange new fluffy beings, and I wish I had been able to take part in this grand adventure of the Star Trek frontier. I don't know what I'm doing. End Cage. It's the puppet episode. I too wish I could transition into an immortal puppet. I already did one transition. What's one more? Come on. Hello, interwebs. I hope you are all doing well because I am here to review the latest episode, as always, of Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 4. This one, Episode 5, Level 5 Transporter Accident, because we are already halfway through the season. And as per usual, I will stay spoiler-free up front and get into spoilers in the back end, but let's just put it right out in the open. This is what I'm going to describe as the much dreaded puppet episode of Strange New Worlds that they announced, I believe, last year at San Diego Comic-Con. And I say much dreaded because it has been a point of contention, I think, around the show, especially as seasons have gone on, that people are getting a little bit frustrated with the big gimmick episode. They've done about one every single season, and while the gimmick episode was kind of fun and interesting in season 1, when they did stuff like the fantasy episode of Strange New Worlds, which I found to be really fun and unexpected, now every season they've done these sort of like big gimmicks, and they ultimately feel like they're done just for the gimmick rather than having a story to tell. And I myself have kind of been on the bandwagon of not enjoying these episodes even earlier than I think a few other people were. Like, I was not a big fan of the musical episode. Not out on musical episodes of Star Trek. I would love a musical episode of Star Trek, and I liked the idea, but the episode itself left me rather disappointed. The songs didn't really work for me, and I didn't really like the message of the episode, all of that stuff. And it really just felt like it was just making it into like a fun gimmicky thing rather than really focusing in on just telling a good story within the Star Trek world. And they've continued to do that every single season. I think last season is where it really got incredibly noticeable how often they were doing it. And so when they announced the puppet episode that was coming this season, I was, and I think along with many other people, kind of like, oh man, are we still doing this? We're doing a thing where it's like, oh, we'll do a gimmick episode because, you know, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or in this case with the puppet episode, Angel did it before, which generally seems to be the impetus for a lot of these writers to do a gimmick episode on Strange Worlds. Like, what's another gimmick another TV show has done? And it's kind of worn out its welcome. And I think puppets are really where you're hitting the jump the shark potentiality moment with the show. So, and certainly this episode also became a sort of point for the anti-woke bullshit nonsense. People were like, look what Star Trek's become. They're doing puppet episodes. They're ruining this classic franchise, which is always annoying and frustrating. But I think those arguments get some credence because of this level of gimmicky stuff that doesn't really have an impulse to tell a story. It's just making Star Trek gimmicks. So I was really dreading this episode, and I didn't expect to like this episode. In fact, I figured it was probably going to be insufferable, and I was going to despise every single second of watching it. Which surprises me to say then that I actually come away from this episode being like, okay, I actually enjoyed this one. I don't think all of it works. There are a few things in this episode that I think are frustrating and annoying and lean into elements of the show and modern Star Trek in general that are just things that continue to frustrate me that they do over and over and over again. That being said, though, I found this episode to work much more than I expected, mainly because despite the fact that they are puppets and that is a ridiculous premise on its face, they treat all the characters as puppets with emotional truth and still as these characters. It would have been very, very easy, I think, for this episode to just quickly fall into a wink and a nod, looking at the camera of like, look, we're all puppets here. Isn't that funny and ridiculous? And while we get a tiny bit of that, most of the episode still just treats these characters as their full characters rather than just cartoonish versions of themselves. And as a result of that, I was able to invest in this episode a lot more than I think I would have thought I would have been able to right after that. And it reminds me the way that Jim Henson would always talk about his Muppets, which is like treat them as actual people and people will start to invest in them as like full characters and beings, just like they would any other character. And that's how you really are supposed to treat Muppet/puppet characters. And I think this episode fell right along with that, where I felt empathy for these characters so that when by the end of the episode we were getting into more hijinks, as certain characters in this episode would call it, and more over-the-top comedic things, I was actually fully bought into it because the first half of the episode spent a good chunk of time actually getting me to buy into these characters and puppets as the characters themselves. And I did not expect the episode to really do that level of lifting, and made the more gimmicky stuff towards the end actually land rather well for the most part. And so this episode was really, really funny, but it also, again, was grounded in a really good emotional journey, mainly for Spock, but a few other characters get a few things here and there as well that I rather enjoyed. And so, yeah, again, I'll have a few criticisms about some specific moments throughout the episode, and one overriding criticism that probably is just going to be a me thing and no one else, but I'll talk about it when I get there. But on the whole, this was a surprisingly solid episode, and one that I came away enjoying a hell of a lot more than I expected to. And in fact, the fact that I enjoyed it at all, I think it means it cleared a higher bar than I expected this episode to do, because frankly, I really just expected to come out of this episode being like, wow, that was insufferable and awful and terrible, and did not expect this to land this way. Again, I am continually shocked by this season of Strange New Worlds. I did not expect to like this season as much as I did. And so when even the gimmick episode, the one that I expected to hate, can impress me, I don't know, we're halfway through the season so far, and there's only been one episode of the season that I found out and out terrible, which is a decent batting average for this show. I might be, going out on a limb to say this season is rather good. We still have a half of a season left to go, so it can still, fall flat on its face. But at this point in the season, I have to say this is a good season of the show. Again, did not expect that, and did not expect to be saying that about the puppet episode of all damn things, but here we are. So yeah, that is my general review of this episode of Strange New Worlds. But to talk about the puppets of it all, let us jump over into spoilers. I have to say, before we go into full spoilers here, I almost considered doing this whole episode with like a little, one of my toys in front of the screen instead of me being in front of the screen. But I didn't want to necessarily shake the thing for like 30 minutes or however in front of the camera. So you're welcome for not making you sit through all of that. I've been enjoying this season, kind of playing with some fun stuff in my videos if you watch the video version of my reviews instead of just listening to them, which is fine if you do. I'm sorry I didn't do that for all of you who've been enjoying that, but I did not want to sit here for 30 minutes trying to match my voice on the screen. So you're welcome for not making you sit through all of that. But anyways, let us talk fully about some spoilers here. Starting off the episode, we have Scotty wanting to do a long distance transport, and that is clearly going to lead to the transporter accident that causes everyone to turn into puppets, as we see later on. But this little beat of Scotty wanting to do the furthest distance transport reminded me of Scotty's storyline in Star Trek 2009, the J.J. Abrams one, where Spock, Leonard Nimoy Spock, gave Simon Pegg Scotty the algorithm for being able to transport incredibly far across vast distances.
The notion of transwarp beaming is like trying to hit a bullet with a smaller bullet whilst wearing a blindfold, riding a horse. What's that?
Your equation for achieving transwarp beaming.
I like that there's a little bit of continuity there, in that in the Kelvin universe, Leonard Nimoy Spock gave Scotty that algorithm, whereas here we're seeing the Scotty of the Prime universe actually developing that algorithm in this moment. So there's a funny little bit of continuity there that I kind of enjoyed. I also like Scotty's rivalry with this other engineer, and he wants to show him up by teasing him with a thing from their academy days. This little Ricky puppet was kind of cute, and it does remind me of like a funny thing that you would do in your college age era. And then also Scotty talking about how he felt like he needed to show up this other guy because Pelia was always mean to him and nice to this guy. And I like that, setting up a tiny minor arc for Scotty as we get into the later part of this episode. It's not a huge one, but one that I enjoy for Scotty in this episode. We also then jump over to a scene where La'an breaks up with Spock. And this is one of my major criticisms here. It's not really to do with this episode too much, but it's more like, what was the point? What was the point of this relationship between La'an and Spock? It was barely given any attention throughout the about a season that we got it, because it was about midway through season 3 that we started this relationship at all. And yeah, I got a few brief mentions here and there, but it wasn't really given any huge focus. And certainly there's moments in this episode where Spock is showing some kindness to La'an. it makes sense for their arcs in terms of La'an kind of distancing herself from other people because she is worried about her anxiety about her genetics and all of that jazz, which again, I'm enjoying that the show is putting it more on La'an's anxiety rather than any actual thing with her genetics. We're still waiting for that Chekhov's gun to go off the season and disappoint me, but it still hasn't so far. So it makes sense that she would break up at this point, and I also like the implication that this was kind of just a fling for her, and maybe Spock invested a little bit more into it than she did necessarily, and maybe not, but it's still more like a casual thing. So I at least appreciated that element of it. But again, like the fact that they're breaking up so soon and that we haven't gotten any super attention to it, I just go like, what was the point? It was so frustrating to see in season 3, especially with that season doing romances all over the place, and we're going to shove Spock in yet another romance just like a few episodes after breaking up with Chapel. So it's kind of frustrating to see that here. And then even in this episode, while we'll get to it at the end, it turns out to have all been a dream. We'll talk about that when we get there. We also still have Spock jumping in kind of into a relationship moment with T'Pring, and it's still like we're going to jump out of one relationship to have him end up with another girl. I know it's a dream, so it doesn't fully stick around canon-wise, but within the arc of this episode, that is what they're doing. He's leaving La'an so he can be, with T'Pring emotionally. It's just so frustrating to see. It's an element of this show that disappoints me and frustrates me, and this is an element that's sort of dangling off of it. Thankfully, it's not the biggest focus of this episode, and I do appreciate that. It's not a huge knock against this episode, but it just speaks to the larger problem that came out of season 3, mostly, of this show that disappointed me, and this season of the show is just having to deal with. But that does lead us to T'Pring coming back, and again, I love T'Pring. It was so good to see her in episode 2, but it was obviously not the real version of her. And in this episode too, we do get to see the real T'Pring, and she is coming in to help Spock deal with his overwhelming anxiety and emotions, and I like seeing her here. But again, we also spend most of this episode not dealing with the actual T'Pring either. Again, as we get revealed at the end of the episode that it was all a dream. Again, we'll talk about it. So it's just like funny that we're barely getting any of the actual T'Pring in this season of the show, even though I do really like her and the actress quite a lot, and I like what she brings to Spock's arc and character and this show. Honestly, I just wish they had kept T'Pring and Spock together from the beginning of the series and not really broken them up too much at all, because I like their dynamic a hell of a lot more than any other dynamic that Spock has with the other women that he's been dating on this show. And I would have much rather like a romance triangle between T'Pring and Kirk rather than like T'Pring on Chapel sort of nonsense and Chapel pining after Spock bullshit. But all that being said, love T'Pring, love that she's here. She's doing great. I also really like that this episode is again dealing with Spock's internal struggle of feeling a little bit more human. One of the things that I've really loved about Ethan Peck's Spock ever since he first started in Star Trek Discovery's second season is that Ethan Peck's Spock is leaning a little bit more towards his human side than expressing his sort of more logical Vulcan cultural upbringing in this show. It's such a good arc that I love seeing this show go on for him, of him embracing becoming a little bit more logical in the Vulcan side of himself than the human side of himself, as we sort of see at the beginning of the original series with Leonard Nimoy Spock being a little bit more Vulcan, and then his character going on a journey from there to finding balance between human and Vulcan sides, as we sort of see in the movies and into all the way into Star Trek 2009, where he kind of fully accepts himself and gives that learning to his younger self, played by Zachary Quinto.
Spock, in this case, do yourself a favor. Put aside logic. Do what feels right.
It's a good arc, and I like that Ethan Peck is sort of starting as we're leading into the end of the series and setting up the original series of this show, that Spock is, in this show, learning to explore more of his Vulcan side and exploring that with T'Pring. So I do really enjoy just that arc that we're seeing here. And in this episode, him coming to embrace a little bit more, as we see by the end of the episode, of using Vulcan culture to sort of tamp down some of his anxiety that he feels in a way that sort of leads him to embrace that side of himself and his culture. Really, really like that. It's a really good arc in this episode for him. And again, what I really like this episode doing, that despite the fact that it's going to be dealing with puppets in a minute, that there's a good emotional arc for Spock here within that. And it's a very strong one, and one that fits his character rather well. And so really great stuff with that. We also get this little tiny beat that plays throughout this episode of Pike having a new chair where he can control a lot of the ship from his chair. And it just made me think, because it becomes a point of contention with this episode when the characters get turned into puppets, that they can't operate the Enterprise at all. And it just reminds me how much of there's this discussion of actually when you're dealing with rocket ships and actual ships that go into space, you're actually going to want tactile buttons rather than touch screens. And while Star Trek, starting especially with The Next Generation, has always done the LCARS touchscreen sort of thing, I liked in TOS that it was a lot of like actual tactile buttons that we don't have here in Strange New Worlds, specifically for this reason, that if the power goes out or something happens, you can't flip switches or do anything. And that's why it's actually better to have tactile buttons rather than touchscreens when you're dealing with going into space. And this episode just proves that out as like an actual problem, because if you don't have any electricity allows you to touch your screens, you're going to be in trouble. TOS, despite being seemingly more retro in its display of technology in that show at this point, actually seems to make much more sense than what we even got in like TNG with LCARS onwards, as much as I love a good LCARS display. We then continue on and we get, obviously, the transporter accident. Scotty causes a big problem and Spock is the only one left not as a puppet. And I loved all the looks of the puppets, especially Pelia's. I loved her hair. It was really funny and ridiculous. Scotty's, I think, was actually probably the most boring looking puppet. His puppet just comes across as like just normal looking puppet, while everyone else had a little bit more personality with their puppet. But yeah, all the puppet designs this episode, I don't know who designed them. I'm recording this review before the episode's releases because I got screeners, so they haven't released the information, like behind the scenes stuff that a lot of other folks will probably have by the time you're watching this review. So I'm unsure who made the puppets, but whoever did a great job. These are really, really great puppets. I loved also seeing Spock having to help everybody because he's the only one that can actually operate the ship, and him feeling anxiety about this. Like, as someone who myself has got anxiety and deals with panic attacks, I actually really related to Spock here, of feeling overwhelmed, of there's too many people having demands on me and feeling like there's too much to do, and it causing to anxiety and feeling overwhelmed. I very much relate to that. And again, I loved the emotional truth within Spock as a character here, despite all the puppets going on. It worked rather well. But then we get Scotty trying to turn people back into humans, and La'an being the one to test this out on, and her arm pops off. And I have to wonder, does this count as body horror? This season of Strange New Worlds has done a lot of body horror stuff so far, and I wonder if this is just another odd element of it. Does it count as body horror if they're puppets? I don't know, it kind of made me think it is. There's a scene later on where Pelia gets cut in half and they have to stitch her together, and I'm like, the fact that they're living beings makes this kind of horrifying in a dark way, of like, man, I know I'm still alive and can survive being cut in half, but like, what does that feel like? I'm so curious. It feels like body horror by a different means, and this season has just done a lot of that in an odd way. But another thing that I really do like here too is that La'an wants to stay a puppet. I like that there's some emotional truth to these characters, and Spock sort of being there to hear her, again, their relationship notwithstanding, this emotional moment of like, yeah, I want to stay a puppet because I'm can't hurt anybody. Again, this is a much better display of La'an's anxiety than we got, and I know I keep making this comparison, but it bears repeating, than 4.5 Vulcans last year, where it was a similar idea of La'an worried about like her genetic makeup making her evil, but that episode was like, yeah, no, your genetics do make you evil because of the bioessentialist way they did that comedy.
The others gave up being Vulcans. That is so stupid.
Being Vulcan affected you differently. You are aggressive, paranoid, suspicious, arrogant. I believe it is part of your core.
Here, with this comedy, La'an is not genetically predisposed to evil, but it's about her anxieties about feeling that, and her wanting to stay a puppet, similar to her wanting to stay a Vulcan back in that episode, comes from a place of anxiety, but doesn't deal in the eugenics bioessentialism bullshit either. So good on this episode for dealing with that. And again, emotional truth of the puppets. Most of this episode, despite just the comedic premise of them being puppets, most of the first 30 minutes of this episode are really just treating these puppets as people, so that when we get the hijinks later, as T'Pring would call them, it really feels much more grounded in these puppets that I come to care about on their own terms. So really enjoyed how well they handled these puppets. I'm very surprised that they did a really good job with this. But then we have La'an pointing out that you've not gone to see T'Pring, and I'm like, Spock, my guy, You are just so bad with women. Just stick to Kirk. You like, how have you not gone to see poor T'Pring this entire time? I get there's a lot going on, but like, see the girl. She's turned into a puppet. You were the one who asked her here. You promised her no hijinks. Go and talk to her at some freaking point, my guy. So, yeah, bad on Spock there. And I do like the scene between T'Pring and Spock, and again, her helping him. The one line I didn't like in this sequence where he says, even as a puppet, you are helpful to me. A few things with that line that I didn't like, where Spock says that to her, I was like, even as a puppet, I'm like, she's still a person. Again, the fact that this is a dream notwithstanding. But, like, she's still a person in front of you, so you shouldn't say even as a puppet. That feels a little bit derogatory as a term towards her. Like, oh, yeah, even though you're this now. It's like, no, she's still a person. She's just different. That's a weird way to say it. It's like if someone was going through a medical problem, it's like, oh, even dealing with your medical problem, you're still useful to me. What an odd way to phrase it. Especially it's like he's still centering himself, like, you are useful to me. It's like, again, she's a person. She may be helpful, and you should be thankful for that. And he does say express gratitude, but like, that's not the only way that's not the only reason she's a person and existent. I don't know. That line just rubbed me the wrong way in an odd way. Maybe I'm over focusing on it, but it was just an odd line. But I do like T'Pring sort of helping coach Spock to deal with anxiety and him kind of not fully listening to it just yet. But then we have this funny beat that'll lead to a criticism that is just for me. But we have this beat where this Orion pirate vessel comes, and I love like Pike trying to hide that they are puppets and him being embarrassed. Also, I should mention him being embarrassed in front of Admiral April was also really funny, and Pike just not loving being a puppet was cute, and hiding it from the Orions, but then ultimately accidentally getting revealed to them was great. And I love seeing the second in command was played by Joe Lo Truglio. Hopefully I'm saying his name correctly, but I remember him from Brooklyn Nine-Nine. He is so funny, such a great comedic actor, and I love him throughout this episode. He's just having a lot of fun, even in just the small bits and pieces that he gets. I think like one of my favorite moments with him that you can blink and you'll miss it is when they're on the view screen and the Orions first see that Pike and everyone are puppets. He doesn't say a word, but his reaction to the puppets on the bridge and seeing them on the view screen was really, really funny. It's just giving some great comedic faces as he's watching this as his captain. She sort of talks with Pike. So that beat was great. And overall, I do really like these Orion pirates. They work functionally fine. This Orion pirate leader is functionally fine. My criticism, and again, this is maybe just a me criticism, but I am wondering, why was this character not Captain Angel from way back in season 1, The Serene Squall? For those of you who don't remember, Captain Angel was the pirate who also took over the Enterprise and wanted to kidnap, I believe, T'Pring in that episode, and was also working with Spock's brother, or half-brother, I should say, Sybok. And when I watched that episode, one, I was really excited that they were setting up a Sybok storyline. I've always been fascinated to learn more about Sybok, even though he was a character in a movie that most people don't like. I found the character very interesting. I also don't hate Star Trek V. It is a so bad it's good movie, and even has some good scenes in it, actually. Like, go back and watch Star Trek V. It holds up better than you would think. It's not a fantastic movie by any means, and certainly plagued with problems, but it's still an enjoyable watch. Like, it's fun to sit down and watch as a movie. Just casual hangout Star Trek movie is where the characters just get to be and exist together, and they're all kind of friends. I don't know. Star Trek V holds up better than you think it does. Again, not a great movie by any means, by any stretch of the imagination, but I do enjoy it for what it is.
What does God need with a starship?
Anyways, I thought they were going to set that up, but they have shown no interest in dealing with that storyline, so it's kind of frustrating that they set that up and never paid it off in any meaningful way. Maybe they still will in the next 10 episodes that they have, or 11 episodes that we have left in the series, but they're running out of time to do so. But also, even within that episode, even sans the Sybok stuff, I loved Captain Angel. Jesse James Keitel did an amazing job as that character, was so fun. And again, they set them up to come back.
My tragic love lost in battle. Oh.
And it's been very, very frustrating that they haven't, because they were one of the best guest stars that the show has had, in my opinion, especially when it relates to Spock. And again, this is another episode that is dealing with Spock and T'Pring, and also pirates, and it feels like it should have been natural for Captain Angel to come back here, especially given that the end of this episode reveals that this was a dream all in Spock's head. And so it would make sense to me that if Spock was having an anxiety dream, he would dream up Captain Angel, who was a character who directly gave him a lot of anxiety about his human Vulcan's side. That was a whole textual conversation in that episode that I really, really liked. One of the things I loved about that episode, just on a personal level, was how Captain Angel challenged Spock to sort of find balance between his human and Vulcan sides by relating to themselves as a non-binary person.
Sometimes we act a certain way to fit people's expectations, but that's not necessarily who we are.
You are proposing I better balance my human and Vulcan natures.
I'm saying maybe you're neither.
I thought that was a great sequence and a great scene. So I really just loved that character quite a lot. And it seems like it should have made sense on almost every level for this to be Captain Angel. And it wasn't. The reason I'm frustrated by this, because at a certain point, it's not really the episode's fault. And this is just me sort of expressing a frustration. And the episode can do what it wants. And I should judge the episode on its own terms. But where it becomes a criticism for me, and again, it's not necessarily leveled at this episode, but at the show overall, is the only reason I can really think, besides maybe actor availability, that they didn't bring Captain Angel back for this role is the show's reticence to really directly deal with queerness in any way, shape, or form. Other Star Trek shows like Starfleet Academy or Discovery have really centralized queer characters within their show in a non-tokenizing way, which I've really appreciated. It's one of the reasons that I've been so happy with modern Star Trek is that, you know, despite its many, many problems, it has treated queer characters as just a normalized part of the Star Trek universe, which is something that Gene Roddenberry wanted all the way back on TNG. And I think they've done a really good job with that. And yet Strange New Worlds, especially in season 3, was so focused on just heteronormative male-gazy style relationships, all the way to the point of the season finale of season 3 was like this focus on Pike and his heteronormative romance with his girlfriend who literally died and ended up on a pedestal as all women do to save the universe because of her love. It was like the most heteronormative, bullshitty relationship nonsense drama that I've seen in the show. And not to say that you can't have heterosexual relationships. We stay at heterosexual relationships. It's fine. But Star Trek to me always should like push the boundaries, especially given that in our modern day, queerness is so under attack. And we saw that with Starfleet Academy, so many people harassing the people on Starfleet Academy. And it just makes me look at Strange Worlds and be like, I feel like the reason you're running away from queerness is because you are afraid of the harassment that you'll get. But Star Trek should be of all the franchises, of all the major pop culture franchises, to be able to stand up to those people and say, fuck off. It should be Star Trek. And most of the other shows have done that, but Strange New Worlds has, I think, seemingly done the opposite, where in season 1, they had non-binary characters. They were willing to acknowledge characters like Chapel being bisexual, even only in an offhanded way.
This is what I appreciate about Dever. You and I are on the same page. Casual, no attachments, it's just for fun. Zero commitments page.
It's more like a book than a page. And you said the same thing about that gal on Archelius too.
And then ever since then has just slowly pulled away from any sort of acknowledgement of any level of queerness within this show, and that it's very frustrating. So again, not necessarily a knock on this episode, but the absence of Captain Angel here just made me think of, and it's a thing of this whole season, and even more last season more especially, of just the heteronormativity of the show and the lack of any desire to showcase any level of queer characters, even the ones that they have on the show, like Chapel, who is bisexual, but they never really acknowledge that aspect of her other than one offhanded line in season 1. And I get more and more frustrated with that. And again, not this episode's fault, but me wanting Captain Angel to be here just reminded me, like, probably the reason they don't have Captain Angel here is because the character's non-binary, and they don't want to have a non-binary character on the show. Maybe I'm being unkind to the writers on that front. Maybe Jesse James Keitel was just not available, or numerous other reasons. You know, maybe Captain Angel wouldn't have fit in this episode for the arc that they were trying to take Spock on. But it's just a notable absence, and one that I at least want to acknowledge once in my reviews this season, because it's not something I want to bring up every single episode, because it's not a problem, at least in an individual basis, but it is just something overall with the show, especially after season 3's extreme heteronormativity, that bothered me. Anyways, back to the episode proper, Captain Angel notwithstanding. I loved seeing the puppets freak out when the Orions attacked the ship, and like them running around going, "Ah!" on the ship was really a funny visual gag. I love Spock having to run down to engineering, and I love Pelia saying like, "Oh, if you're not needed on the bridge, or if you're in the bathroom, I don't know." And so that was a good little one-handed line. I also love that Ethan Peck, when he runs to go down to engineering, he like stumbles out of the chair and like jumps over the banister, and you sort of get this hustle from his character. It was just a fun physical choice by Ethan Peck. It was something small and subtle that I enjoyed. Feels like very overwhelmed just in his physical presence as the character. And I love Scotty being stuck under the torpedo, but having been unable to get out the entire time because he's a puppet was another really good gag. And then I love T'Pring when Spock's going up to the bridge and trying to help with the Orions, that she's like carrying an armload of phasers. She's like, I was trying to help. And I'm like, you only need to bring one phaser, my girl. Why would you bring an armload of them? It was a great like subtle visual gag there. But then obviously the Orions attack the ship, and so they capture Spock and they start torturing him to get the command codes. And I love the La'an Una fight sequence. It was a good comedic beat that is earned because we treated these puppets more like people until this moment. If they had just been wall to wall like, ha, look at these puppets, aren't they funny? From the top, this visual gag, when it does happen, when these characters do try to fight the Orions, it would have landed not as well. And so this is the first beat where we really, really got some comedic usage out of them being puppets overall, and it worked rather well. So did enjoy that. We then have the Orions taking the bridge. Again, I've talked about Pelia getting cut in half and the body horror of that, and I love the sewing up of her as a medical procedure by Chapel was a good bit. And I love Pike being the one's like, I'm going to go and try and rescue Spock. And, I may be shorter and fluffier, but I'm going to try and save Spock. And then I get a good scene between Joe and Spock, the torture scene. Again, Joe is having a real fun time. He's a great character actor. He's very comedic, and he's not overstated and overplaying it, but he's just, the way he handles himself is just so fun. And I love this talk about the matriarchy of the Orion culture, and him being like, yeah, just listen to women. They just do what they do and you don't have to worry about it. And that being like, in a roundabout way, good advice for Spock to like, no, listen to T'Pring. She's actually helpful in terms of helping you find balance between your human and Vulcan sides, and dealing with your anxiety and letting it go and sort of finding it like Vulcan center. I thought it was a funny way to get to that point, but it worked rather well. Again, the emotional arc for Spock in this episode works a lot. However, this does lead to another moment of criticism where we have the Orion pirate captain. She spaces Pike out the airlock. First and foremost, I don't mind this as a beat. Like, the horror on Ethan Peck's face when this happens is really, really good. And the fact that it's treated with the emotional weight, again, treating the puppets with emotional weight is really, really good. And we obviously know Pike is not going to die, and that the surprise, as we learn in a few minutes, is that the puppets can survive in space. Really good. Really like that. I thought all of that was good. The moment that I disliked quite a lot, and I'm sure a lot of you can guess this, is the fact that on the glass, as he's being put out the airlock, Spock does the Vulcan hand thing as a Easter egg reference to Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and Leonard Nimoy's Spock's death there with Captain Kirk. One of the most emotional moments in Star Trek.
I have been, and always shall be, your friend.
I really hated this for a couple different reasons. First and foremost, it's the show thinking that this Easter egg reference is a funny beat. It's not funny, really. It's like oh, look at that, they're referencing that. And it kind of throws me out of the moment as like, oh, they're referencing that thing here, rather than like being in the moment of this. And it's not funny, really. It's just an Easter egg that tosses me out of the episode. So on just a functional level of what it's trying to do, I don't like it. I don't think it works just in the moment emotionally for the episode, just on its own terms, and replacing comedy with Easter egg references. However, your mileage may vary on this. We're doing this here, and we're having Pike even say the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Like, in universe, this means that Spock had an anxiety dream about this moment, and then later on, he did it with Kirk in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. It now makes me think, like, in that moment in Star Trek II of Wrath of Khan, when he's dying in front of Kirk, that he might be thinking of this puppet dream he had one time. In universe, it lessens the moment. Again, your mileage may vary on that. Like, who gives a shit at a certain point of like canon element of that sort of thing for me. But for me, it is one thing that just bugs me a little bit, as it lessens it in universe for the character. You can toss it aside and ignore it if you so wish, but just one of those things that always bothers me. I just dislike, generally speaking, writers, especially in the live action shows, using Easter eggs to replace sort of emotional cathartic beats, even if it's meant as like a comedic gag. And here it just does not land on multiple levels. So really hated that moment. Just overall thought it was terrible. I think the scene would have worked much better without it. But we do have Pike surviving in space, and him coming up to the Enterprise and like floating there and surviving reminded me, if any of you have watched the show Avenue 5 from Armando Iannucci, same guy who did Veep, who was also in the latest season of Taskmaster, by the way. If you watch Taskmaster, I love Taskmaster. But Armando Iannucci made this show called Avenue 5, which is a sci-fi comedy show. Really good. You should check it out. Ethan Phillips, who played Neelix in Star Trek Voyager, is in the show, and it's a really great time. But there's a really good gag in that show where they're basically on a cruise ship lost in space, and they have to shove a body out the airlock to get rid of it. And then because they are the only large body of mass in the vicinity, the body starts orbiting the ship. And so they look out the window and they just see the body floating around their ship because it's orbiting their center of mass. And it's just this morbid, dark joke that Pike just floating near the Enterprise as the puppet just reminded me of. Not the episode doing anything, just reminded me of that beat, and it made me laugh. But I do love that when they bring Pike back in, his whole thing is like Owen being a puppet and T'Pring being like, I don't want to deal with hijinks, but like she's able to access like some level of emotion that she's not able to, and like race the chaos demon. If you read Dungeon Crawler Carl in the book 8 of Dungeon Crawler Carl, it just made me think of like, yes, worship me, the god of chaos. So like that is sort of the moral here of like, just embrace being a puppet. Let's just have some fun with it. I also love that Scotty creates an electric glove and Pelia compliments him on that and saying like, again, small arc for Scotty here of like, you were always the one that could handle it and I was pushing you harder because I knew you could take it. And I thought that was great. And also Scotty getting shocked by his own glove was a good comedic beat there. I love that the way that they got out of the room from the Orions guarding them was them pulling basically a Vincent adult man by being like 4 puppets in a trench coat. It was really funny.
What's your name, stud?
Vincent. Adult man. Vincent adult man.
You hear that, Bojack? Vincent is an adult, and I'll bet he knows how to treat a lady.
He very clearly isn't and doesn't.
All of the visual gags here as they sort of take back the bridge was really good, like them using pencils to attack the guy or grabbing his feet, or Spock at one point like throwing Pike into the chair was all really cute. Like the Orion pirate lady shooting one of the crew members through the gut and creating a hole and the crew member surviving. Again, body horror stuff here in an odd way. I also love T'Pring going to rescue Spock and setting herself on fire. I thought that was very clever. My only thing here is like she uses a mind meld to tell Spock the information. Why are we doing mind melds for everything? She really could have just told him the plan. It's not that complicated of a plan that she couldn't just set it to him. They overused the mind meld on this show quite a bit. So it was a little bit like, all right, sure, we'll use the mind meld. I think they just wanted the visual of a puppet doing a mind meld to Spock. It wasn't funny enough of a visual to earn just overusing the mind meld, in my opinion. But chaos on the bridge, very, very funny. I like that Spock is able to embrace the chaos as well, and he sort of solves the day by cutting out the air that the puppets don't need. Very, very clever. Then we have Spock getting saved because they all go out into space, and I thought this was cute with them in space. This does lead to the end of the episode, though, where Spock, again, journey to being more logical, has this good moment with T'Pring, and they end up kissing. Funny visual beat. I did like that as a visual. But again, it's sort of this, oh, we're doing Spock romance T'Pring thing again. It's like, can we just have Spock talking to women and not having to make out with them? Please. I know T'Pring is someone who has romantic feelings for it, but can we just do that can we just have Spock not be in romance stuff? Please, for the love of God. I just need it to not happen anymore. But this does lead to the end reveal of the episode in that it was all a dream. And basically Spock worked it out on his own. Just before I touch upon that element of it, I do like the end here where T'Pring's like, all right, well, let's just hang out now. You seem to have worked it out yourself. And I love Ethan Peck being like freaked out by Scotty's puppet in his room. Ethan Peck playing that moment was really, really funny. Just being like slightly perturbed in a Vulcan way about it was very cute. The thing that I don't like, I'm mixed on this reveal of it was all a dream. I mean, obviously it's a cliche of doing the it was all a dream thing, and that's sort of a cliche and usually a terrible writing technique. I do understand why they did it, because the fact that they were all turned to puppets does stretch credulity within the Star Trek universe, even more so than, say, like, the musical episode did. Like, the musical episode was also stretching credulity in universe, but they decided to make that literally have happened. But I understand, like, the fact that they were all turned into puppets stretches the Star Trek universe and taking it seriously to a kind of a breaking point. And so I understand the writer's impulse to be like, it was all a dream. And then it sort of preserves the groundedness, I will say, for lack of a better word, even though Star Trek has always played a little bit with how grounded it actually is. I mean, we've literally had Q turn people into Robin Hood characters and such. So like, Star Trek's always played a little bit fast and loose with how grounded it actually is. So I understand to a degree why they did it, but at a certain point, like, I've been watching this episode, taking it at face value of like, this has actually happened, and you did enough of the work to make me invest in it. So like, by the end of the episode, like, I was already like, all right, this just happened. It happened, and I will deal with it as a thing in the universe. It's whatever. I know some people will not be able to get by it, but you know, I've already suspended my disbelief enough to take it as this. And so by having the reveal at the end be like, oh, it was all a dream, it's like, well, I was already bought in anyways. Why did you need to like undercut it, being like, well, it didn't really happen? It feels like unnecessary to do, given you've already asked me to suspend my disbelief. I already did that work. So why do you need to undercut it in this way? It feels like it's only done as a way to respond. Like they wanted to do a puppet episode, but they wanted to like not set off the most annoying of Trekkies who would be like, well, actually, this makes no sense and you're ruining Star Trek. It feels like a way to respond to that rather than just, you know, be like, all right, just have confidence in that you did this. Star Trek has done weirder shit. And you've already had me do something like this before with a musical episode, even though I didn't like that episode. So I get kind of very mixed on that. It was all a dream. I think I land more on the negative than I do on the positive. I don't even think I would be positive on it, being like either neutral or negative on it, and I lean more negative. So yeah, I think that's the only real big criticism of that ending there. Like I said, at the end of this, I come away from this episode being like, yeah, this was actually rather good, and I enjoyed my time watching it. Certainly not perfect. I had my issues with it, like the Vulcan hand thing there, and also my personal frustration about Captain Angel, things here and there. But overall, this was a really fun episode, and one that, again, I did not expect to like. I expected to despise this episode, and I'm sure some will. I'm sure there were some people, and I think understandably so to some degree. This show has overdone gimmicks, so I'm not going to necessarily even begrudge somebody who watches this episode very frustrated with it. I think that is actually, personally, I think that's very legitimate as a reaction to this episode. But if I'm going to come to this episode and just take it as it is and try to see it on its own terms, I think it did rather well. I think it did as well with this concept than it really could have. And I did not expect that. I did not trust this writing team. I did not expect this writing team to be able to do it that well, but they did. And hats off to them, and I am impressed by it. I enjoy this episode. This is an episode I would return to, which again surprises me. So yeah, I do not begrudge anyone who would be frustrated or dislike this episode, even just on its face. But for me, taking it for what it is, I enjoyed it. I thought it was rather good. And that surprises me. Again, Strange New Worlds keeping going with for me at least, a continually impressive streak this season so far. Again, the bar was in hell, but we are still clearing it. So at least I'll appreciate that. What did you think of this episode? Did you enjoy the puppets? I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below. But beyond all of that, my friends, I hope you, as always, live long and prosper.